Hi, Suzanne. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, Carola. Thanks for inviting me today to talk to you.
I thought we could start by talking about what happens to the lungs during the actual birth process. If you could tell us something about that.
Okay, so in a physiological birth, not so much happens to the lungs in terms of a big change happening until really the first breath. Because what's important is that the lungs, when we're in the womb, we're basically breathing fluid. Our lungs are collapsed and there's fluid, and some of that fluid we swallow. When we swallow our amniotic fluid, it goes into the lungs. So there's this very watery quality to the lungs. That's probably the best way of saying it. And also it's important to know before the first breath that, as well as being filled with water, that they're not connected to the heart in the same way that they will be afterwards, because they're not active yet. And so they're actually being shunted around, that the blood doesn't go into the lungs to be oxygenated. So there's a shunt in the heart, and also there's a shunt in the liver. And this is attached, part of the fetal circulation when we're in the womb. Remember, we're not breathing. Well, actually, when we swallow the fluid, that actually helps to tone up our muscles and our rib cage and diaphragm, but it's different because we're getting our oxygen through our navel. And that's a really important transition that happens at birth. We all know that the placenta gives us our food, but it also gives us our oxygen. So again, lungs are quite connected with stomach. And then after birth, of course, we start taking in air from the outside. So that's a really big shift. So during birth, it's really, because we've still got the placenta attached, so not much changes really during the birth process until we're born and we take our first breath. So if we're born into water, we don't take our first breath while we're underwater. We carry on with the same fetal circulation. I thought that might be nice to add in. It's not even when when we come outside our mother, it depends what environment we come outside into. So if we're born in water, we carry on with this fetal circulation until we take our first breath, which is why the first breath is so important, because the first breath actually forces the water out of the lungs, which is then absorbed in our body. And it starts, because it needs to be quite a big first breath to then start shunting the blood. Now it starts to close the valve in the heart, the ductus arteriosus it's called, and then it links up with the heart. So there's a very close connection, as we know, the organs of the lung and the heart. And I think you shared that a link that I found interesting with the heart and the lungs. And Gil says that the lungs are a bit like the wings of the heart. I always say the penetrating vessel is also the wings of the heart. So blood and oxygen are very closely intertwined. And so it's with the first breath that you get changes both in the circulation between the lungs and the heart. And then then that's how we then breathe for the rest of our life. But also there's
Sorry, what about the idea that the vaginal birth actually helps to squeeze fluid out of the lungs? How important is that?
That's really quite important, because the preparation and the sudden change of pressure, we've been compressed as we're going down the birth canal, and that prepares us for this first breath and then the sudden change in fluids. And then the breath is stronger, and it has been shown that babies that are born by cesarean are more at risk of having lung infections and all sorts of things like that. Also allergies. I mean, it's more complex because they're not being exposed to the bacteria of the mother as they've gone down the birth canal. It obviously depends at what stage of labour the cesarean is done, but it definitely it means the lungs aren't primed in the same kind of way. But especially it's that sudden change of pressure when you've been squeezed, and all of a sudden you come out. It's a big change of pressure. Whereas if you're delivered by cesarean, the change of pressure isn't as much. And so we do know that, I mean, it's a well-established fact that babies born after cesarean are at a higher risk of lung infections and respiratory asthma and breathing difficulties, all sorts of things like that. Yeah.
What have you heard the idea that compression is very helpful for babies with after a cesarean birth, that C-section baby? I was wondering what kind of compression is required. Is it like sort of shiatsu type compression?
Yeah,
or swaddling or what?
It's what I say to people. I call it foundation touch when I teach baby shiatsu. That not for premature babies, it's a bit different, but because they're not really ready to have strong touch. But a baby that's born at term, which is any time from 37 weeks, they if you think how much they're squashed as they go through the birth canal, and also their head is really compressed, and we know that the foramen of the head, the plates are not fused, so the head can often be quite compressed, and then but the whole body goes through quite a strong process of compression before we emerge. And so for babies that have been born by cesarean, I say that baby shiatsu is even more important. I mean, part of it's holding the baby against the body, but part is really, often people are a bit scared of holding babies, or how, you need to give them a light touch. Actually, I always say to people, think of how the baby was in the womb, with the womb all around them, especially at the end of pregnancy, when the womb is contracting more in preparation for birth, and then all the contractions of birth. It's quite strong. The womb becomes the biggest muscle in the body, and so the baby's really being squeezed. And so it's actually quite good to imagine that you're kind of like the womb, holding the baby and just squeezing, really. I mean, obviously you have to see how much touch. I'm not necessarily trying to give exactly the same, but just feeling how I can squeeze. Or I teach parents more, but teaching them how to really give as much pressure as the baby wants. And working with babies, it is quite easy in the sense that they'll show you. If they're not happy with something, if it's too strong, they'll just wiggle, and they'll give some sign that it's too strong. And anyway, usually parents start off, it's too light. And then when they go a bit deeper, the baby really relaxes, and they often go quite still. So they do show you, but especially compression all around the rib cage and into the front, but also into the back and into the neck and the shoulders can really help. But then also just working all the meridians for a baby, but in quite a broad way, because you can actually include all the meridians if you just squeeze. And we have to remember that for babies, the flow in the meridians doesn't have the same yin and yang, because that's only established when we stand upright. So for a baby, you always, for the yin and for the yang, start at the shoulder and then come out from it, which is how you'd work lung. But large intestine, you also start at the shoulder. So lung and large intestine, you can do together very much in a nice compressing kind of a touch.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
I was really interested when you were saying about swallowing the amniotic fluid and it ends up in the lungs.
Yeah.
So how does that happen? The direct connection between the esophagus and the lungs? Yeah.
And it just, then we swallow. Yes, exactly. It just goes down into the lungs, and babies. I don't know if you remember, but a lot of people notice their baby actually can get hiccups when they're in the womb, and that again, that's all preparing the baby for breathing. I've just find understanding what happens in the womb is so fascinating, because you see how things don't just happen once. Our body is primed. So of course, even a cesarean, a baby that will eventually be delivered by cesarean, has still had this practice breathing, and maybe hiccups. And hiccups is good, because it's actually, quite strong movements to prepare the diaphragm and to prepare all of our respiratory muscles and the rib cage and the lungs to be, it's all. And then birth is like another stage. So if we miss out on that stage, if we have a cesarean, we can still catch it up, because it's only that one moment that we've missed out. Yeah.
But I love that movement that you've been making when you've been imitating the compression, and then you do the coming out, and it's like this extraordinary expansion into life, which looks amazing. I mean, what an experience is that for the lungs, for the baby, for the corporeal soul. Do you think that's when the corporeal soul really becomes most active?
Well, it's another phase of development of the corporeal soul, because of course when we're in the womb, well, of course, we are very connected to our mother, but I still believe, and this is my experience of my own pregnancies, but also the clients I'm with and working with babies, they're connected, but they already have their own separate soul. Sometimes they're very similar to the mother, but sometimes they're very different. But of course, they are completely dependent on the mother. So it's another stage of separation, I suppose we could say, when we're being born, that the baby can exist independently of the mother after birth. But also the corporeal soul, it is interesting, isn't it? Because corporeal, that we become, it's another stage of becoming embodied, because in a physiological birth, we are really compressed, but also there are reflexes that support all of this. And one of the most important for birth is the Moro reflex, the startle reflex, when we have this movement and then we stoke, and so there is that real opening. So it's like, now we've come from water, where we're bathed in water and our lungs are bathed in water. So we're quite watery. We're like water beings. We're remembering our connection to the sea and water. And then when we're born, the first breath and space and all this, and feeling space and air all around our body and feeling the weight of our body as well. That's quite a big shift. And so that's another stage of the corporeal soul, of feeling this separation from our mother. And that's why we have this startle reflex. But of course, then it's not just one moment again, and especially for babies that may have to be separated from their mother temporarily, because we still really need our mother. I mean, ideally, our mother would hold
I still need mine.
Yeah, well, exactly.
Yeah.
And ideally, our mother would feed us, because our body is more adapted to breast milk, because breast milk, again, it's a transformation of blood and essence. So we are still quite connected to our mother and receiving our mother's energy if we're being breastfed. And in most traditional societies, babies would be breastfed for a few years, and breast milk is totally adapted to that particular baby and to what's going on in that baby's life. So it's quite a miracle food, because it isn't just food on a physical level, it's emotions, it's hormones, it's so much stuff.
Well, it's essence, yes.
And it's essence.
So I know this wasn't part of what I was planning to ask you, but where does the poor dad come into this?
Where does
because the way you're describing it, it's like this sort of symbiosis of mother and child. I mean, we've both experienced that from both ends.
Yeah.
But what about dad?
Dad, well, he gives his essence at the moment of conception.
Yeah.
but
really,
I mean, he is there, but more babies do recognize fathers' voices if the father's been present during the pregnancy, and it's that they are still important, but I see it more as they're holding the space for the mother so that she can nourish the baby. And that's still, for me, quite a big role after the baby's born. And it just takes the baby more time to get to know the father in that more physical way. But I think it's really great to encourage fathers also in the pregnancy to touch the baby through the mother's abdomen, through the mother's back. I do lots of work with partners, getting them to connect with the baby through touch, through shiatsu, but also through sound, through their voice, and through their presence, through their connection with the mother. And then when they're born, it's amazing. You can see when the father speaks or touches the baby recognizes who they are. I mean, I don't know if you've worked much with women in pregnancy, but I also found that if women have come to me regularly during pregnancy, they're also used to my voice and my touch. And then if the mum comes to see me afterwards with the baby looks at me, and I know that they recognize me. And if I touch the baby, they recognize my touch, they recognize my voice. So for fathers, of course, if they're there a lot, the baby recognizes them a lot more. And I suppose, again, if you want to bring it back to lungs and corporeal soul, then the baby comes in separation with the mother, but into more connection with the father. And for fathers, I always encourage them to hold the baby as much as they can, and often fathers like to sleep with the baby, and they're building up their relationship in a different way. But I think they're still important.
Yeah. It is really interesting, and it's a whole different chapter, a whole different ball game about how much consciousness is present before birth. But it has quite big implications, so we probably better not go there.
Yeah. Other than
Can
to
I
say, I
ask
think
you?
it is. And I think other than to say that consciousness, I believe, is there actually even from before conception. And I know that that's what the ancient Chinese believed, that the soul decides to incarnate with this particular mother and father, or these days it could be two mothers or two fathers. There's, it's much more complex, but the soul decides and chooses their parameters. And that for me, it's during the pregnancy, it's different stages of incarnation. And then birth is, of course, another big shift. But all of this is like levels of coming in and the soul coming in.
Yeah. Well, going back specifically to the lungs, I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the connection of the lungs to the liver as well as the heart. Is that mainly through the circulation, or is there another connection there?
Yeah, I've got a picture that I'll show briefly, because it's quite complicated, and I'm not going to go into loads of complications. But I just want to show in this picture, you can see the placenta, that's on the left-hand side, and how that's where the baby gets its breath from, essentially, and the navel. And for me, that's quite a shift after birth, that our breath, we could say our breath when we're in the womb comes in through our navel, because it comes through, oxygen comes through the placenta. And then it's shunted, a lot of the blood is shunted around the liver. There's a ductus venosus. And then also you can see how, well, we know that liver is very close to the lungs anyway. And then there's also another shunt around the heart. You've got the foramen ovale and the ductus arteriosus. So I think it's quite good to see the placenta in that picture, which is kind of as big as the lungs, and they are our lungs. So I think we can see that continuation, that our lungs are also outside, connecting us to the mother, connecting us to the outer world. The placenta is the most outer part of our body. And I personally feel that we still have a connection with that. I'll stop the share now, but we have a connection. Okay. If you think of the placenta as partly our lungs and partly our stomach, and that's connected to the mother. But then after birth, we don't have the placenta. Ideally, you see, that's an important thing with the placenta. You don't cut the umbilical cord, because it can take a bit of time for the lungs to actually get going. If the baby doesn't breathe straight away, maybe the baby doesn't take a first breath because it's been a long labor and they're tired. Maybe the baby doesn't take the first breath straight away because they're stressed or traumatized, or they just need a bit of time. And so if the umbilical cord isn't cut, the baby's still receiving oxygen. So it's a transition. Hopefully it's not a sudden, and actually it can be quite shocking for the baby if you cut the umbilical cord before the baby's breathing has really established. Then you have to do resuscitation. Whereas actually, if you can not cut the umbilical cord, then the baby, it's like a more gentle transition. The baby gradually makes the shift. It's not all in one go. They're getting the oxygen through the placenta, and then as the cord gradually stops pulsating, which can take a few minutes, the baby gradually starts breathing. And
minutes.
Yeah,
because I mean, when you see, for example, Call the Midwife on television or other, you see it in films. They're like, they're in there with the scissors immediately, aren't they?
It's not very good. And actually,
I'm sure that used to be quite common practice. Actually, just sort of baby out, cut the cord. There you go. No.
At certain
I mean, like, I'm talking like about 50 years ago.
Yeah, I was going to say at certain historical periods. I'm sure in most traditional cultures, in some cultures, they actually would see the placenta as, well, it's part of the baby. It comes from the fertilized egg, so it's not part of the mother. That, you know, only the bit that attaches to the mother, the outer bit. But the placenta is part of us, and in many cultures, they see the placenta as a bit like our twin. So it's another part, another aspect. I mean, it's amazing, this whole other organ. We create not only our physical body, but a whole other organ that supports us, that is our breath, that is kind of our outer body. And we still have the memory of that and how we were separated from that, which was our part. We can see our lungs, we've got our inside lungs, but we've got our outside lungs, which are our placenta. And so many cultures, they would not necessarily cut the cord for ages, and in some cultures they'd actually wait till the cord dried up. They wouldn't cut it, they'd wait for it to naturally fall off, and that can take a few days. And in
my goodness, there's this thing now called the lotus birth, isn't there?
I was going to say that's what it's called.
Yes.
And I think in a way it's good, because I always say to people, it makes you stay at home with your baby, which is also what they do, because it's an awful lot of new information that you know have to digest through.
We should explain first of all, in case people haven't heard of what a lotus birth is. Yeah. It's when you actually have the placenta there, full, isn't it? I mean, carrying it around on a cushion after the baby.
Yeah. You don't basically, you don't cut the cord. You wait, so you can the best, it maybe is the best. I didn't know about it when I had my 2 children, but I knew that it was important to wait till the cord stopped pulsating, because that's physiology. That's the body's insurance system. That's the body making sure that you have got oxygen. There's not a panic that you've suddenly got to make the baby breathe, which is kind of forcing the lungs. And for the ancient Chinese, they said the first breath, of course, imprints on us completely deeply. It's our first experience of being out in separate from our mother, of breathing, and whether it was calm. They emphasize calmness and not stress. But if your first experience is shock and like you've got to breathe or you're going to die, that has quite a major impact on the rest of your life. Whereas if your first experience is, oh yes, we can wait till the cord stops pulsating, at least that. And if you wait until the cord actually dries out and the placenta detaches, that can take a few days. And I always think that's quite good, because mothers aren't really going to go out with their baby attached to the placenta. So it kind of makes them stay at home. And that's in most traditional societies, especially in ancient China. It was really important for the mother to stay at home, because mostly through the energy is very open, and they felt that she needed to come back to herself. But the mother's energy is very open, but also the baby's energy is very open. And it's an awful lot of information for the baby to process if they're taken out into the world. And so it's just a kind of allowing the baby time to just get used to the new environment, through the lungs, through the skin, through finding their new place. And if they allowed a bit of time to do that, there's not so much of a shock. Because they say the Chinese, they knew the close relationship between the lungs and the heart. And they say, I don't know if you remember that practice of hitting the baby to make them breathe. That's shocking for the lungs, but it's also very shocking for the heart. It's like, you're making me have this breath. So no, ideally at least not cutting the cord, but even maybe leaving it to just shrivel up. There's not really much written that I found written in ancient Chinese texts as that. Oh, actually there was one thing that I always thought was a bit odd about placing the baby on the earth, but on the soil. Whereas for me, the first earth for the baby is the mother's body. So putting a baby on soil. But we all know in ancient Chinese medicine, like in any form of healing, there are lots of different traditions, and some we can understand why they're helpful, and others we think maybe we can't do everything. The ancient Chinese.
maybe something about taking the baby out of that close connection with the actual individual mother and offering the baby to the great mother, the earth, that's the mother of us all. I don't know, maybe.
Yeah.
Suzanne, it's been so interesting. I know we could go on with this for ages, but it's been great. Thank you so much.
Thank
For
you.
this
Well, I hope you
conversation.
understand more about.
Have you got some contact details you can give us? Because I'm sure some people are going to want to contact you about this kind of stuff.
Yeah, you can just my website is wellmother.org.
Wellmother.
And I have a YouTube channel, and if anyone has specific videos, I actually haven't made one on this yet, but I maybe should make a video. I'm thinking of making videos on all the extraordinary vessels and then different phases of our lives. So yeah, either through my website or look at videos on my YouTube channel. That's probably best. But you can see it really, I'm really passionate about supporting life
You are.
from the beginning.
It's great. Yeah. Okay, so is your YouTube channel also called Wellmother?
I think it is, yeah. If you search Suzanne Yates Wellmother.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.